We were speaking last time about the concept, again, of Mashiach, and we were referring ourselves to a certain specific point in time, the 17th century, the 15th, 16th, 17th century, specifically in the time of Rav Yitzchak Lurie, the Ari, and a little further on, and we were investigating the concept of the Pnimis Torah. Now, last time we went into the notion that the Rebbeinu gave Moshe Rabbeinu the Torah itself, which is composed of the written law, and he also gave Moshe Rabbeinu what's called the oral law, which is an explanation of the Torah itself. And that explanation, of course, has to do with all the halachas, the laws that we've received in the Mishnah, in the Gemara, and so on, the laws that relate to how to perform the 613 commandments. Now, as we said last time, there was another aspect that the Rebbeinu gave to Moshe Rabbeinu, which Moshe Rabbeinu did not share with most of Klal Yisrael, with only select individuals. Whereas every Jew was entitled to receive the Torah, both the written oral law, just by the mere fact that he was a Jew. He was not entitled to receive the deepest level of the Torah, which is called the Pnimis Torah, or really which is called the Sod of the Torah. That was not a right of a Jew, but rather the right of a tzaddik. To receive the Sod, one would have to be on a certain madrega or a certain level. So Moshe Rabbeinu passed down this from generation to generation, and it was passed down from generation to generation. And as we said, there were basically certain individuals who revealed that light, or aspects of the light. Now, what exactly is this Pnimis Torah, the inner light of the Torah? Of course, it really is nothing more than an understanding of really what the reason for all things are. Something we'd all love to know, you see. Why the Rebbeinu created the world, how he supervises the world, how he runs the world, what is the purpose of man, what is the cause of evil, what is the cause of good things that happen in life, what is the ultimate destiny of man, and so on. All these things are part of the Pnimis Torah. Why do things happen to people? Why do good things happen to people? Why do bad things happen to people? And so on. All these topics and their explanations were given to Moshe Rabbeinu, who passed it down. Now, the information that was given to Moshe Rabbeinu was very great, so that Moshe Rabbeinu understood an enormous amount of what this stuff was about. And this information was only revealed at certain points in history. And even when it was revealed, as we said last time, it was revealed as a mashal, as a metaphor, never really being revealed as a nimshal, or as a symbol or idea behind the metaphor. You see, this is very important. And we said that the reason why this information is conveyed in the terms of metaphors is for two reasons. One, because the sages wanted to hide the information. You see, only for those who are worthy of it. And the second reason, which is another very important reason, is that a lot of this information is only subject to being a metaphor. Because when you talk about spiritual events and spiritual processes, you have to use physical symbols to talk about these things. Because we cannot understand these things as they are, because they deal with the deepest levels of existence and consciousness. In any case, this Pnimis Torah, as it was handed down from generation to generation, was called the Kabbalah, or the tradition. And the reason why it's called the Kabbalah is simply because of the fact that this was also a tradition. Just like the Taryag Mitzvahs, or the 630 commandments is a tradition, so was also the deepest parts of the Torah. It is a tradition. So that if you would say, well, how do you know this to be true? And the answer is, I received this from my Rebbe and so on, who finally received this from Moshe Rabbeinu, from the Rebbeinu himself. That's how I know these things are true. Now, in the time of the Tanoim, or the time of the Rabbi Akiva, the time of the people who wrote the Mishnah, one of the greatest exponents of this knowledge was Rav Shimon ben Yochai, of course, who was buried in Arizal in Meron, and he wrote, finally, he revealed a lot of this information, and he revealed this to his students and to other people, to his son. And the book that was written, the manuscript that was written to convey this, was called the Zohar, which means the Book of Splendor. And the Zohar is nothing more than a commentary on the Torah according to its inner strata. It is filled with mishalim, with metaphors that are really bizarre. And the Zohar itself, the Ari, Rabbi Yitzchak Lurie, warns a person not to take the metaphors literally. You see, the Zohar speaks about the Rebbeinu in the form of a huge man and it talks about the beard, and it analyzes the eyes and the hair and the beard and the form and so on. And one would wonder, what does this have to do with the Bnei Shalom? And of course, the answer is a metaphor. It has nothing to do with the Bnei Shalom, but it refers to the levels of existence that he created, and each particular aspect of this man, this Adam Kadmon, which is called, or primordial man, is a metaphor for very, very deep things, and so on and so forth. There are many, many aspects of it. The contents of the Zohar were hidden for many years, for another 1,000 years, and they were finally found again in the 12th century, in the 13th century, in the 1200s, by a person, Rav Moshe Shem Tov de Lyon, who then publicized it, and many people thought that he wrote it. And Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan has an excellent, very scholarly analysis of this whole controversy on who wrote the Zohar. You see, all the Apikosim believe that Moshe Shem Tov de Lyon wrote it, and all the Fuma Yidden believe that it was Rav Shimon ben Yochai. Men as great as the Vilna Gaon and the Ramchal and the Ari, there's not a question who wrote the Zohar, Rav Shimon ben Yochai. And the story of how Rav Shimon ben Yochai wrote it is a very interesting one. He ran away from the Romans. The Romans government had persecuted them. What happened once, there was a conversation among three very great Tanoim, and they were discussing about the Roman contributions to civilization. And one said that he thought that the Romans had contributed very important things to civilization, and another one said that he thought that he was questioned that very significantly if they contributed anything in that way. He had nothing really to say. And the third one, Rav Shimon Yochai, said they contribute nothing because whatever they do, it's for their own glory and for their own honor. They are really very arrogant, evil people in that way. And that was Rav Shimon Yochai. And word got back to the Roman governor, who then sentenced Rav Shimon Yochai to death. And he ran away with his son, and they came to a small cave. So anyway, he lived in a cave in Pekian with his son, and they were there for 13 years, and it was a miracle. A date tree arose in the cave, and there was a stream that came by, and they learned with Eliyahu Novi for 13 years in this cave. It was an extraordinary 13 never come out of a cave, but they lived with Eliyahu Novi, and when they came out, they were astounding in what they know. I mean, it's unbelievable. Before they went into the cave, there were Tanoim who were much greater than them, and then when they came out, they were much greater than all, so that Rav Shimon Yochai and his son, Rabbi Eliezer, were the two greatest in the world at that time. They were really astounding. Even Malachim considered them, they were greater than Malachim in their understanding of these things. And they had written Zohar, and this is what happened. But again, like I said, it was again hidden, and it came out in the 12th century, and then it became much more popular, but a lot of people didn't understand it. It was still quite an unknown sefer, and there were different Kabbalim in that time, until finally the Ari appeared in the 16th century, in the 1500s, 1520, 30, 40, 50, and he was an astounding individual, and he understood the Zohar exactly the way Rav Shimon ben Yochai had meant it. More than that, he expanded on the Zohar, because he himself had learned with Eliyahu Novi for many, many years in Egypt, and he had expanded on it, and he came to Sfas from Egypt, and he met Rav Chaim Vital, and the two became, as a master and a student, the Ari, Rav Yitzchak Luria, Rabbeinu Yitzchak Luria became the Rebbe, and Rav Chaim Vital, who was already one of the greatest in the world, became the student. And for 2 years, Rav Chaim Vital learned from the Ari, only for 2 years, whereupon at the end of that time the Ari died. But in that time, he gave him an enormous amount of material, and what happened was Rav Chaim Vital wrote it down in manuscript, and it turns out it came out into 16 volumes of this thing. Tremendous stuff. But he never published it. His son Rav Shmuel Vital finally published it, and what it's called is the famous 8 gates of Shmona Sha'orim, called the 8 gates. Each one called Sha'ar, the gate of Sha'ar HaKavonos, Sha'ar Gegulim, the gate of intention, the gate of reincarnation, and each of these books deals with one complete area, and so on. But the truth of the matter is that even with all the stuff, a lot of it was still unknown, because there were many masters who understood this, but very few people understood what the Nimshal was. What is this stuff? Like the many terms in Kabbalah, spheres, Partsufim, and so on, and Divugim, many interesting concepts in Kabbalah which are very, very mysterious and really very unknown. Like even in the Neshama, there are 5, for example, that there are 5 sections in the Neshama. Even that is a mashal. Even though there are 5 sections in the Neshama, but what does that mean, the 5 sections of the Neshama? What exactly does it correspond to? 5 levels of what? That is also, on a higher level, that's a mashal. That itself is a metaphor for something else. What really is a neshama? What is it? See, these are all really metaphors. And nobody ever really explained these things. And there were many students at that time from the Ari, from the Arizal, who were some were greater, some were less, and so on. Who really understood the Ari, who didn't understand the Ari is very difficult. There were many Sfardish people at that time. Sfardish Goyim. The Sfardim were known in Kabbalah. That's what you find even today. The Sfardim in Kabbalah, the Ashkenazim don't touch it anymore. I mean, it's a tremendous taboo. But with the Sfardim, I mean, it's always been a very, very great thing. And the Sfardim have always produced tremendous Kabbalah, and so on. Now, the Ari died in the 16th century, in the 1500s, in the mid-1500s, and Chaim Vital lived a while longer. He lived quite a long life, and he died in Damascus, of Chaim Vital. And his son, Rav Shmuel Vital, finally published the works in the early 1600s, in 1620, 1630, around that time. That's when these works will first really begin to be published. They were called the Kisvei Ari, the writings of the Ari. And they must have had immediate acceptance because they quickly went around the world. And it's an amazing thing that a lot of the information there is really strange. I mean, this is not your typical sefer by any means. Yet nobody ever got up to argue with it. That's one of the most interesting, because we all know in the case of Jews, there's an interesting joke that they say where this person was shipwrecked and he came in an island, and then the first thing he did was he started to open up a shul, and they said, why opening up a shul? There already is a shul on this island. So he said, yeah, but maybe there'll be a machlokes in the other shul. I mean, the fact is that whenever you have a bunch of Jews together, there's always an enormous possibility, unfortunately, for machlokes and so on, and Jews many times find it very difficult to agree on anything, or really to get together. It's like, I think once Golda Meir said to Nixon that the difference between my country and your country is that in your country you have 200 million people and 1 president, and in my country you have 3 million presidents. And that's what it is. It's very difficult for Jews to agree on anything, but what's astounding is that when the Kisvei Ari came out, there was no one just about who had anything to say negative about the Sefer, even though the Sefer was such a far cry from anything that you would ever read, because it's all mashalim and metaphors. But somehow everybody understood who the Ari was. I mean, who can argue against the man who can look at you and tell you where you've come from since the Marishan and prove it? Who can look at you or a man can look at you and tell you what will happen to you in a day from now or a week from now? Who knew every gezerah that Shemayim had against the Jews or for the Jews? And simply, if anything happened to you, if you got sick, or whatever stories, you simply go over to that Ari and says, why did this happen? And he would tell you the full reason of why it happened. Whoever met such a person. Who could have met such a person that from the odor of your body, I don't mean, I'm not talking about whether you bathe or not, but from the peculiar odor of your body, the chemicals and so on, he could tell you what sins you did, or what you didn't do. Or he can look straight into your neshama and tell you exactly why you're here, and what mitzvahs you would have to do, and what you would have to fix up, and so on. I mean, who could even define such an individual who can look at you and tell you 1 minute from now what you will say before the thoughts even entered into your mind? It was an astounding, like a malach, and so on. And his bracha was extraordinary. I mean, the bracha of the person was extraordinary. The Ari was at home with malachim, with shadim, with every form of neshamas, every form of ruchnias. The Ari saw, and it was in total at home, just like you're at home in your own family. That's exactly how the Ari was. He was as much at home in the Shemayim as he was down here on earth. The truth is, he probably was more at home in the Shemayim than he was down here on earth. There's a book, Baba Sali, on Rav Yisrael Abu Chasera, who passed away several years ago, and he was an incredible tzaddik. But there's a book, Baba Sali. He was called Baba Sali in Moroccan. He was a Moroccan Jew, and he was a tremendous mekubal and a tremendous tzaddik and Baruch Kodesh. And you read the stories in there, it's not believable that a normal human being could do these things. I mean, what he was able to see, and his brachas, and so on. I mean, for him to cure cancer on terminal people would seem to be almost mild, if you really put his mind to it. I mean, it was astounding. It was literally astounding what he was able to do. And, just one story, a simple one, it's amazing. There was one place in Morocco where apparently it hadn't rained for a long time. and a long, long time, and they built a mikveh apparently, and they needed rain, and it didn't rain, so he got out and he started davening that there should be rain, and it hadn't rained I think a long, long time, and suddenly it started raining, and there seemed to be a problem with the mikveh of some sort. It stopped raining, and there was a problem with the mikveh, and because of that, I think they had to empty the water. And so like that. So he went outside and he began to daven and said, look, we want to make sure that this mikveh is totally kosher, so the mikveh should even go according to the halakha of this person. And it started raining again. I mean, it was things that you haven't read since the Gemara. And if this was as great as Baba Sali was like a child compared to the Ari. I mean, like a child compared to Rabbi Yitzchak Luria. So you can imagine the thing. I mean, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria was a throwback, an absolute, if I may use the word, freakish personality who you had not seen his like for 1,500 years before. He was a total throwback out of his, a person like that hadn't been 1,500 years before, 2,000 years before. That's how far back you have to go to find a match for Rabbi Yitzchak Luria. But this is essentially what it was. But Rabbi Yitzchak Luria revealed something to Rabbi Chaim Vital, which is very important for us, because he told Rabbi Chaim Vital, and what he said was, I want you to daven for the Mashiach ben Yosef. You should be inspired for him because he is in a very great sakana. And Chaim Vital apparently either took it half seriously, and very shortly thereafter, the Ari died. And it says that Rabbi Chaim Vital realized that the Ari was the Mashiach ben Yosef. I mean, without question, I don't understand why he didn't realize this before. He had every symptom, he had every symptom of a Mashiach, every sign of a Mashiach. And the Ari had died, and he realized who the Ari was. But this tells us something very important. You remember what we did last time with Rabbi Akiva? And how we saw the information about Rabbi Akiva, the concepts of what, the fact that Rabbi Akiva was a Mashiach, and how we were able to understand many, many different things that happened in his time. Well, with the concept of that, the Ari was a Mashiach, and he was more than a Mashiach. He was obviously very close to becoming a full Mashiach in a real sense of the word. We can understand many things that happened in that period of time. And the truth of the matter is that when the form of the Ari came out, about 67 years later, two enormously powerful events occurred. One in Judaism and the other in the rest of the world. Very, very powerful events. And we will look into these two events, and let's discuss them both. One event was a very strange, bizarre event that had happened to the Jews that had not happened since the time of Rabbi Akiva. If you all recall, one of the major events that happened in Rabbi Akiva's life was that he identified a man, Bar Kokhba, as being the Mashiach, and he really felt that the Messianic times were at hand. That did not occur because Bar Kokhba died, and so on. But that was one time when literally the Jews were very much convinced that there was a Mashiach at hand. Such an event had never again occurred to Klal Yisrael until the 17th century, to the year about 1650, 1640, 1650, 1660. Until there appeared a man, and his name was Shabsat Tzvi, who's a very interesting person, a very strange and interesting person. And Shabsat Tzvi, along with another individual, Rav Nosson of Gaza, he lives in Gaza, appeared in a certain way, and what they both claimed, what Nosson of Gaza really claimed, and this was what it was that Nosson of Gaza was a very great Makubal. He seemed to be an outstanding man, knowledgeable in the Kabbalah of the Ari, and many of these things. And he said that Shabsat Tzvi was the Mashiach. That's what he said. He claimed that Shabsat Tzvi was the Mashiach. And for some reason, for some strange reason, it was accepted by many, many, many Jews. This was no crackpot suddenly. Even though it turned out that Shabsat Tzvi was a false Mashiach, for some reason, the impetus and the momentum of that thing went around to the entire world, so that all over the world, Jews from Europe, Jews from Eastern Europe, from Western Europe, and from the Arabian countries and Turkey and so on, believed that Shabsat Tzvi was a Mashiach. And one of the reasons was that Shabsat Tzvi was a very great learned man. He was a Makubal also, a very great learned man. What happened finally at the end, after scores and scores of communities believed that he was Mashiach, even very great men. I mean, I once looked at some of the men who considered him to be Mashiach, and I tell you, it was astounding to see. And even if they didn't consider him to be Mashiach, there were many men who were tremendous people who were doubtful about the possibility, which means that he was no small slouch, Shabsat Tzvi. And the one man that I would mention is there's a very great man, Rav Moshe Zakut, who was one of the Talmidim, one of the students of the Ari, and his Talmud was Binyamin HaKohen, whose Talmud was one of the Binyamin HaKohen, and from Binyamin HaKohen was I believe the father-in-law of Yeshaya Batsan, who was the Rebbe of the Ramchal. So Rav Moshe Zakut, who lived in Italy, I believe they lived in Venezia, and in the ghetto community, it was in the community, did not know if Shabtai was a Mekubal or not. Now you talk about a man who's one of the greatest Mekubalim in the world, that was not clearly able to figure out whether Shabtai was a real or false Mashiach. That showed you the enormous power of Shabtai, you see. And that was because of Shabtai had a very, very great koyach. Now Shabtai had a very bizarre kind of situation where there were certain things later on toward the end, where he attempted to tell the Jews different things, and one of the things he tried to do was and certain times he ate unkosher food, and he said that since he was a Mashiach, he was allowed to eat unkosher food. There was one time when he had a chasana, he had a marriage, and he got married to the Sefer Torah. He did some really bizarre things. But in spite of all these bizarre things, there were many people that thought he was Mashiach in spite of it. Now why? Because chapter 3, who understood the Zohar, many of these things, explained a lot of his behavior in terms of these basic Kabbalistic concepts. And what he basically said was, which is a true Kabbalistic concept, you see, was that the Mashiach, one of the aspects of the Mashiach, and one of the chief purposes of the Mashiach, strange, which the Kabbalah says, is that the Mashiach has to, what the Jews have to do as a whole, is to gather back all the Kedusha that they've lost through their sins. That's what they have to do. And once they've gathered back all of that Kedusha, then the redemption arrives. Now the last of that Kedusha, or the last of that power, which the Jews as a collective nation has lost, has yet to be gathered back. And there's only one man who can really gather that back, and that is the Mashiach. The job of the Mashiach is to go back, to go down into what's called the Klippas, or into the areas of very questionable practices, and gather back that light. Because remember we've said, as I said last time, many times, that when the Jews fail to be deserving or worthy of the Kedusha, that Kedusha goes in the hands of the Satan. And what the Satan does is that Kedusha then transfers to the nations of the world, and then they have the power to persecute the Jews, you see. But what Shabtai claimed, based on what basic concepts in Yari, is that the Mashiach has the power to go into the Tumah, live there, and pull out that Kedusha. Now this concept we see in the Nach, in the Nevi'im, because there was an individual who was a very prophet, who was a Navi, and who was a Shofet, who literally did that. Shimshon, Samson. Shimshon HaGibor was the Shofet, the main judge of the Jews, and he went down and he lived among the Philistim. He was the only Jew there. He didn't go down there, he was a Jew. He went down, they lived among all these Philistim, the Goyim. And he took himself a wife, Delilah, who was a Shiksa. Now there's an argument whether or not she converted or not, but I won't go into that. There are those who hold that she never converted, she was a Shiksa. And Shimshon married her. And now there's very deep reasons why all this had to be. Because Shimshon had a neshama of a Mashiach. He did, you see. And even Yaakov Avinu, when Yaakov was giving out the blessings to his sons, he looked up ahead and he saw that from the tribe of Dan there will come a man, and his name is Shimshon, and he thought he was the Mashiach. But then he saw again, Baruch HaKodesh, that Shimshon was going to die at the hands of the Philistines, and he realized that Shimshon is not the Mashiach. That's why it says in the Brach of Dan, V'shu'atcha kivit Hashem, that what, for your salvation, we hope for your salvation. And Yaakov realized that Shimshon HaGibor would not be able to do what the Mashiach was supposed to do. But we see from the process of Shimshon, a man who was a giant in Kedusha, to go live among the Goyim and marry a Shikta without necessarily being affected. And the truth is, the Mashiach has a neshama capable of that kind of thing. So Shabtai embellished on this and elaborated on this, and he said, that's exactly what Mashiach has to do. So he began to master himself all kinds of things with Yisum. He ate chaza, you see, he did all these bizarre things. And he would explain this in terms of Kabbalistic terms. So he wrought a tremendously great confusion, because the fact was that in the Kisvei Ari, it is known among the Kabbalah, among these people who understand this, that the purpose of the Mashiach is to go into the Klippa, you see, and take back the last of the Kedusha. And the Klippa means to go into the world of Goyim, or the world of Tumah, or whatever have you. It does mean that, you see. And that's why many people were very confused about chapter 3, until finally, the Sultan of Turkey got wind, the Ottoman Turks, the Sultan of Turkey got wind that there was a man among the Jews who is calling himself Mashiach, and he called him in front of him and he says, what's going on over here? What are you trying to do? Take the Jews away from me? And he sentenced him to death. And what chapter 3 was, he converted to Islam. Once chapter 3 converted to Islam, he lost most of his following. But there was a certain of his because there was a certain number of Jews who still believed that Shafti was still the Mashiach. They were his Chassidim. They remained, they were called Shabbatiniks, not Shabbatiniks, at the current day, but they called Shabbatians, and what it was is they believed that even after his conversion to Islam, he was still a Mashiach. How do you explain the conversion to Islam? Simple. He had to go into the Klippa, and he had to absorb the Klippa. That's where he's sitting now. That's how they interpret it, you see. But most of the Klal after that completely denied it, and they said this is not Azoivite is not possible. So far, this is ridiculous, and they dropped it. See, but there was always secret sects and cults after that who were Shabbatians, and they lasted for a long time after that, all the way for another 100 years. You see, till the 1750s, 1760s, until finally from the Shabbatim came another sect from a guy Jacob Frank and his daughter, who finally took that concept to its ultimate concept, and he said that we want to bring the Messianic times and the Messianic period, so in order for us to do it, in order to bring the Mashiach, we will go into the Klippa, and we will do all the Chatoim we can. So they became involved in many, many sexual practices. In order to bring, that's how twisted the logic became. In order to bring the Mashiach, they were called the Franken, and that was, they were told even, but Jacob Frank was able to convince many Jews based on this notion, which had an essence of truth to it, you see. So 100 years later, you had the Frankists and so on. Now, chapter 3, I think, converted in the year 1666. That's when it finally ended. And what happened is the Gedolim of Klal Yisrael became very, very frightened because they saw the power that a person had. Now, why did chapter 3 have such an enormous power on the Jews? Why? Well, in 1648, a terrible, terrible thing happened to the Jews, which is called the Chmielnicki pogroms, where over 100,000 Jews were killed in Poland. Hundreds and hundreds of Jewish communities were killed by the Cossacks. In the wars between Russia and Poland, the Cossacks invaded Poland and they killed, in fact, there's a famous story with the Shah, the Sister Khan, who ran away. There's a famous story with him and his daughter, where he got separated from his daughter. But there were many, many very great Tzaddikim Gedolim who were killed, Al Kiddush Hashem, as a martyr in this Cossack revolution. And the Jews had to stay in such sorrow, obviously, that they were just waiting for Mashiach. Chapter 3 obviously had appeared at the right time, you see, at a time of very great sorrow. But it's more than that. It was more than just that the massacres and pogroms. There was the fact that chapter 3 obviously knew what to tell many Jews, and more than that, he was informed to an enormous amount of the Kabbalah and the Kisvei Ari, you see. But after he converted, and then he died a while later, shortly thereafter he died, many of the Gedolim said they were very frightened, and they said, what's going on over here? You see, we have to be very careful that such a thing never happens again. So after that, what they did was, they started questioning the entire learning of the Kabbalah. And the whole Kisvei Ari became overshadowed by this whole Shabbatian movement. So that any new person who arose after that, as a Makubal, that had any kind of a strange practice, would be instantly under the surveillance of the leaders of all the communities, and if possible would be exiled. You see. Does that mean that nobody learned the Kabbalah? Of course not. But what happened is it put a stop on the incredible momentum of the Kabbalah in its publicizing, in its gradual publicizing among the Jews. Were it not for the event of chapter 3, then the books of the Kabbalah, the learning of the Kabbalah would have been much more prevalent than it was then. But the Shabbat Tzvi movement put a tremendous damper on that thing, and anyone who learned Kabbalah was considered with suspicion of possibly being a Shabbat Tzvinik, Shabbat Shvati. And in fact, there was a very big machlokes between Yodis and Eibshitz and Rav Yaakov Emden, two very, very great people. Rav Yaakov Emden is the one who wrote the Siddur. Rav Yaakov Emden and Rav Yonatan Eibshitz was an extraordinarily gifted Talmid Chacham. He was a goyin, a tremendous Eloi. And Rabbi Yaakov Emden thought that Rav Yonatan Eibshitz belonged to Shabbat Tzvi sect. You see, there was a very big machlokes in terms of that. So there were many battles among very big people about whether or not you belonged to Shabbat Tzvi and who said what and so on. It really caused enormous controversy. Okay? One of the people that was affected by this controversy, and affected very, very severely, was Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. And because of the fact that he was born maybe 30, 40 years after chapter 3, went into the Tchaim and so on, and everything happened, made him an instant suspect, and especially because he was so strange. He was very weird, Ramchal. Why was he weird? Because first of all, when he was 18 years old, he had a yeshiva and he taught Kabbalah. He didn't even have a beard and he was not married. He was teaching Kabbalah, and as I said, he had certain students, and one of the students was Katia Gordon, who then wrote a letter to a friend of his, or to some other person apparently, and that letter got out, and in the letter, Rabbi Katia Gordon describes how Ramchal was zoicha to Gilu Neshamas and to learn with Malachim and to Gilu Eliyahu. And when this information got out, many of the great Chachamim of Venetia in Venice, which was not far from Padua, where he lived, began to think that maybe this Ramchal, maybe he's a Shabbat Tzvinik, maybe he's a person with Shabbat Tzvi, maybe he's coming up, he's a new Mashiach coming up, or whatever the story was. And they really hounded him. They hounded him terribly, to the extent that they said that you've got to stop teaching Kabbalah, you've got to stop doing all these things. And finally, in order to make shalom, what he did was he took many of the books that he wrote and the sform that he wrote through his learning with Malachim. There's a lot of the songs. There's one sefer written on Koheles, 1,000 pages on Koheles. It's a commentary on the Megillus Koheles, all written by the dictation of a Malach, and so on. He wrote another Zohar. He wrote an amazing sform, and he had to hide it all. He put it into a chest, and that chest was then a box, and that box was sent to Frankfurt on the Main in Germany, and then it was buried somewhere in Frankfurt. So a great deal of Ramchal's sform lies buried somewhere. And he was put in the Cherem, the Ramchal. He was exiled, and he left, and he went to Amsterdam, where he became a lens grinder, and he was there for a certain amount of time. That's where he wrote the Mesilas Yesharim in Amsterdam. But over there he was accepted by the Jewish community. And then later on he moved to Eretz Yisrael, he went to Akku, and he died in Akku with his entire family in a plague. It was a plague, and he died at 40 years old. So he had a very difficult life. He was always constantly under persecution, and the reason why he was always constantly under persecution was because of what happened 30 or 40, 50 years before with chapter 3. Everybody suspected everyone else of being a Shabbatian. That's what it was. Now the Ramchal did something which is very, very unique. He did something which had never really been done before. And Ramchal revealed this himself in the letters of the Ramchal. And he said that Elionovi appeared to him and said that there are 3 great neshamas that will come down that will reveal the light of the Pnimis Torah. 3 that have been specifically chosen to reveal that light. You see, the first is Rab Shimon ben Yochai, who wrote the Zohar. The second was the Ari, who expanded on it, and he writes in the letter, he says, Uboch Hashem asher bocha bi. And I thank the Bonasham, and the Elionovi says that I was chosen as the third light to reveal this Pnimis Torah, or the inner meaning of the Torah. But what Elionovi said, he said 2 things to him. First of all, your light and what you will reveal is greater than the other 2. Not that you're greater, but what you will reveal is greater than the other 2, number 1, and that light will someday be dispersed in the entire world, and when that happens, the Mashiach will then arrive. Because your light will begin to be the light of the Messianic period. Now, if you look at the Ramchal's writing, you will see something very, very different between what he writes and everyone before him. What the Ramchal did for the first time was to begin to reveal the Nimshal. He began to reveal what all the strange stuff was, what it was talking about, so that for the first time you could understand what this was about. Now, it's interesting. As I said, what the Ramchal revealed for the first time was the Nimshal, to such an extent that the Vilna Gaon once said eventually, the Vilna Gaon said, and this is very unusual, what the Vilna Gaon said was that when he learned this form of Rav Chaim Vital, who, as I said, is a man who learned from the Ari, he said that when he first started learning the works of the Ari written by Rav Chaim Vital, he was unsure if Rav Chaim Vital understood what the Ari was saying. He was unsure if Rav Chaim Vital, who was the biggest Talmud of the Ari, understood the Nimshal. But after he examined this form much more deeply and so on, he realized that Rav Chaim Vital did understand the Nimshal of what the Ari was saying. So Rav Chaim Vital obviously understood it too. But he said on Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, it's not a question that he understood the Nimshal. And he said, Baruch Hashem, I also understand the Nimshal. So you see from what he's saying, two things. Vilna Gaon, who was considered, well, this is what they say on the Vilna Gaon. Vilna Gaon, of course, was the great supreme Litvak. But Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who was the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Baal HaTanya, who was the first Baal HaTanya, said on the Vilna Gaon that there are men who are perhaps as great as him in the knowledge of the reveal, like in the Gemara, the Talmud. But when it comes to the knowledge of Kabbalah and the mystery of the Torah, there is no equal to him in the entire world. That was said on the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon was like a super giant. And he said this on the Ramchal, that there's not a question that the Ramchal understood the Nimshal. In fact, the Vilna Gaon was very, very much taken with the Ramchal, and as I've explained last time, the Vilna Gaon said that if the Ramchal were living today in his time, he would walk halfway around the world to Padua to learn Musa and to learn Torah from him. That's what he had said. So the Ramchal was in an extraordinary position, and he was told to write. What the Ramchal said was that the Ari was forbidden to write, even though the Neshama of the Ari used to go up to the Shemayim every night into the yeshiva of the Mala and learn there and come back down and remember what he learned. He was not allowed to write anything down, whereas the Ramchal was commanded to write. And what he was commanded to write was a new light that had never appeared in the world. For some reason, basically what the Banishim said is, I want the world to begin to learn who I am, what I want to accomplish, and what I do to accomplish my objective. That's what the Banishim says. I want Klal Yisrael to finally begin to understand, because with the beginning of the Ramchal, and this entire time, it's the beginning, you see, of the coming of the Mashiach. So the Ramchal therefore was chosen for the specific task of revealing the underlying concepts of what the Kabbalah is like. Strangely enough, since the Ramchal died, which is about 250 years ago, most of that time has seen the Jews ignore the writings of the Ramchal. Because were it not for the fact of the Vilna Gaon, the truth is, the Ramchal would probably have been largely forgotten. Because as I've said, the Ramchal was put into excommunication, the Cherem, because of what he was. They could not understand who he was at that time. And his books would never have been learned at all, were it not for the fact that the Vilna Gaon held him in such incredibly high esteem, and nobody is going to argue with the Vilna Gaon. Just like no chassid will argue with the Baal Shem Tov, no Litvak will ever argue with the Vilna Gaon. Too, there's no chassid will even argue with the Vilna Gaon when it comes to these things. And this is essentially what it was. So the Vilna Gaon was like a machshir, you see, or a machshir. He gave a hechsher, or a hechsher, which is a statement of worthiness to the Ramchal. That's why they learned the Ramchal. But only his Mesilas Yesharim. Most of the books of Moshe Chaim Luzzatto were essentially completely ignored. It is only now, in the last 20 or 30 years, that you begin to see a real upsurge in the Ramchal, and Jews beginning to take him very seriously. Only the last 20 or 30 years, which is a very, very positive sign, you see. As I say, what he said about himself and what Eliyahu Novi said to him. Now, the interesting thing about the Ramchal was that you find in one of his poems where Elianovi is talking about Chal, he calls Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto Malko de Mashiach. He calls him the Mashiach. And what you see from this very clearly is that Ramchal, without question, was a living Mashiach. He wasn't a finished Mashiach, but he was a living Mashiach, which means that if his generation had been worthy, he would have been the Mashiach. Just like Rav Yitzchak Luria, Ben Yitzchak Luria would have been before. He was mamash a Mashiach.
What does that mean?
Wait.
Oh, yeah.
So we understand Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto and how he relates to Ari. Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto learned from people who had learned from the Ari. He was several generations after the Ari, but his Kabbalah is the Kabbalah of the Ari. He took all the writings of the Ari and he explained the Nimshal. He began to explain to a large extent what they mean. Now, does that mean that if you look into this form of Ramchal, you will understand what the Ari was saying? No, it doesn't. Because the truth of the matter is, Ramchal himself needs a commentary. And the fact is that even though Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto's books today, in Derech Hashem and the Das Tfunis, these forms that he has today, are translated in English, they still remain, to a large extent, very difficult to understand. Many of my shurim are based on what he said, and are an attempt to organize the ideas of Moshe Chaim Luzzatto and to make them relevant to the 20th century. Many of the ideas, you see. So that many times in many of my shurim, even though they sound like old ideas, you see, but somehow they fit into the clothes of 1986 or 1987, or in America, and so on, it's because of the fact, what I've attempted to do is take many of his ideas. I've started with many of his ideas, and I've expanded on them in two directions. One, to understand much deeper what he's been saying, and also to make it relevant to the 20th century. This is very important. So, what I've discussed is some of the historical aspects. We have yet to go into the hashkaf of this. This is just the basic history. Now, there was something else which happened. An extraordinary thing happened at the same time as Shabtai Tzvi was around, a little before. But the time that this form from the Ari was beginning to be published by Rav Shimon Vital, and the beginning of Shabtai Tzvi, when this stuff was all going on, there was another very great historical event that was happening. By the way, I will say one more thing before I actually go into that. Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, you see, wrote a book, a sefer called Kinis Hashem Tzvokos. That's the name of the sefer. And he wrote that sefer in order to explain why Shabtai Tzvi was a false Mashiach. Remember how he said that Shabtai Tzvi used the Kabbalah in a certain way, used the concept that the Mashiach is the last one who goes in and brings the Kedusha back for the Jews, and from the tomb itself, that he literally goes down to that level to take it back, and that very few people were able to deal with what he was saying. The Ramchal wrote an entire sefer to explain exactly the fallacy in his ideas. And what he said was very simple and very basic. You know what the fallacy of Shabtai Tzvi was? He says the following. Very simple idea. He says that Shabtai Tzvi was 100% correct. The function of the Mashiach is ultimately to be in the Tumah, you see, and bring back the last of the lights. But the question is, how does the Mashiach get into the Tumah? Does he go in there voluntarily, or is he born in them involuntarily? And does he always try and get out? That's the difference. What Shabtai Tzvi said was that the Mashiach can go in there voluntarily and say, here I am, let's have a good time while we're taking out the Kedusha. That's absurd. Because Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto says, no one can do that. Nobody can, go into an Avera and say, I'm going to do this Avera in order to what? To do a higher, holier purpose. That's ridiculous. Because when you choose to do a chait, you are choosing. You are using your bechira. And what that does, that connects you to the Sultan himself. That's following in the Yisrael's direction. You can't willfully go in that direction. No Jew is ever commanded to do a chait. It's ridiculous. But the Mashiach is an individual who will be born with such pressures on him and such difficulties, they will find themselves in a very dark place. Not because he wants to be there, because somehow there are aspects of his personality and his nature which hold him there like a prisoner. And for the life of him, the one thing he wants to do is to get out, but he cannot. And the attempt to get out causes him incredible agony. And it is that agony which releases the Kedusha. You see that? Very simple understanding. It's not the entry into a darkness or the entry into a klipa or into an avera which removes the Kedusha from the what? From that dark place. But rather it's the attempt to get out and the inability to get out. And the agony which results in the realization that this is not good and this is terrible. That's what releases the Kedusha. You see? We understand this? This is what Mashiach says basically is why the whole Shabbat Tzvi is totally wrong and why Jacob Frank later on of course was totally absurd. You see? And that's basically it. Because the Mashiach is born as a sick person. The Gemara, we will get into this in more detail, but the Mashiach, when the Gemara refers to Mashiach, it refers to Mashiach as a choli, as a sick person. And the Gemara, I mentioned some stories about the Mashiach being described as a person with fixing his bandages constantly and putting on new bandages and being very, very sick, a very sick person. The sickness of the Mashiach is not a physical one, it is a spiritual one. But it is a real sickness. And it's that sickness which prevents him from being the Mashiach. You see, it's the fact that he's connected to a different side and he cannot be the Mashiach. And and everything he wants to do is to break out. He's like in chains. You see, and the chains which hold him are powers and forces and directions which go to the other side. You see, and he does everything possible to break out, and he cannot. And it's the fight and it's the struggle of breaking out which eventually weakens the chains. And that's finally when he becomes a Mashiach. That's the battle of the Mashiach. You see, it's a whole different situation. But we will go into this more at length. Much more than when we define more or less what this whole conflict is about. You see, these are very, very deep things. But I just wanted to mention these things. So what Mashiach did was to write a book on the travails or the difficulties of the Mashiach in order to explain the falsity of Shabbat Tzvi. Now, let's go back to what I said before. There was another event that happened before the Ramchal was born, which was at the same time as what? As Shabbat Tzvi, which is extraordinary in its implications. There were two individuals who literally yielded a profound change in all of Western civilization since their time. And I'd like to explain to some degree who these individuals were. Let us depart now from the world of Jewish philosophy, okay? And let us go into the Goyish Welt and to the concerns of the Goyim in that time. Many people will look up at the heavens, for example, right? They would look up into the heavens and they would wonder, they would see many things moving. They would see stars and they would see the different planets, Jupiter and Mars and so on, the ones that are visible, Venus and so on. They would look at them and they would wonder, what kind of motions do these things have? We all know that everything is moving constantly. The sun is moving, we see the sun moving, the moon is moving all the time, the planets are moving and so on. And what the people tried to do in those times was try and figure out what these motions were. So there were two individuals. One of these individuals was a man called, his name was Tycho Brahe. And Johannes Kepler. What Tycho Brahe did was, he had certain instruments, sextants, certain types of astronomical instruments. And he had an observatory. I believe it was in Denmark, I'm not sure, I believe it was in Denmark, or in the northern latitudes. And he had a small observatory, and what he did was, he observed, you see, with his student Johannes Kepler, many of the planetary motions for many, many years, and he wrote them down in books, so that he literally calculated where the planets were, all the planets were at different times of the day, or different days of the year, different months of the year, different years and so on. So over a 30-year period, he knew all the different motions of the planets. So what he had done is he had studied, or he observed, you see, the movements of the planets over a long period of time. Johannes Kepler, his student, sat down and looked at all these charts, and he said to himself, can I make sense of all this? Can I understand all this stuff? Can I understand from the basis of all these different facts that one day Venus is here, the next time, a week later, Venus will be here, 6 months later it'll be here, and so on and so forth. Can I make some kind of sense and understand, you see, what the shape of the world is, what the shape of what's going on? So what Johannes Kepler says, he figured out, and based on an earlier theory, he said the following. Based on my observations and the observations of my teacher, Tycho Brahe, for the last 20 years, I see that the sun is really in the center, and that all the planets move around the sun, not in a circle, but in what's called an ellipse, like an oval shape. That's what he said. He understood that the motion, the way the planets moved, was oval shape around the thing. Not only that, he understood different relationships between how fast these planets are moving in terms of how close they are to the sun. And what he realized, that the closer a planet is to the sun, the faster it's moving. And the further it is away, the slower it is moving. Now he didn't understand why this was. But he understood based on an analysis of all his observations that this is what was going on. And he made several. So that what Johannes Kepler did was formulate 3 laws of planetary motions. He explained the motions of the planets in terms of 3 basic laws. Now, if you would ask him, why do the planets move around the sun? He would say, I have no idea. Why are they held by the sun? He would have absolutely no idea, in any sense. Now, at the same time, around the same time, there was another man, Galileo Galilei, who was also studying the laws of motion, and who studied what? The planets with his telescope. He was the first one to build a telescope, and he studied the laws of falling objects. You know, what he did was he took various different objects, and he watched them fall. And he tried to explain, to understand how fast things fall. And by observing through many experiments, he's the one who went up to the Leaning Tower of Pisa and dropped the 2 different objects, a heavier one and a lighter one, to see which one falls faster. But he's the one who conducted these many experiments, and on this basis, he also formulated many concepts in the laws of motion. A while later, there came a man, Sir Isaac Newton. And Isaac Newton did what no man has ever done before him. He did the most astonishing thing that a person has ever done, probably in the area of the knowledge of the world or physics, since the beginning of the world. He explained why this stuff was going on. How? Because what Newton said was an amazing thing. He said that between the planets, for example, and the sun, there lies a force called gravity. And that this force called gravity exists not only between the planets and the sun, but also between the moon and the earth, and also between any object that you drop, you see. And it is this force of gravity which is responsible for so many different things, like the tides, falling objects, planetary motion. Not only did Newton discover the laws of gravity and describe exactly how it works, he described how powerful the force is, depending on how big the object and how far away the 2 objects from each other. But he went further. He also understood more than that. He also invented a new field of mathematics that had never been done before, which was needed to explain this, and that was called the calculus. He applied the field of mathematics called the calculus, you see, to his laws, and what he did was, in 5 minutes, he generated or produced the 3 laws of Kepler, which took Kepler 20 years to formulate. He did it in 5 minutes. Because what he did was, he understood, you see, not simply how the planets move, which Kepler understood, but he understood why the planets move that way, what laws they were following. And then he took his laws and he expanded on it, so that with the basic mathematics and astronomy that he was able to discover, he then figured out how to predict the motions of what? Of planets for the next thousands and thousands of years. He was able to predict the motions of comets, when they come back and when they go out. So that suddenly, for the first time in history, men understood exactly how everything is moving up there. To an exact prediction. This was no small thing, this was no guesswork. They could predict, literally, when a solar eclipse would happen. They were never able to do that before. An eclipse was always an unknown event. Suddenly the sky got dark, because the moon covered the face of the sun. But with Newton, with Newtonian physics and mathematics, they were able to predict, from now on, every solar eclipse that would happen. Long before it happened. Hundreds of years in advance. So you can see the contribution of Newton and Galileo. Basically, what Newton and Galileo did, what Galileo first started, and Newton really finished, you see, was to do something that had never been done before. What they did was, they wanted to understand how the world works. And instead of sitting in a chair and speculating how the world must work, well, probably the world must work this way, or maybe the world will work this way. What they did was, they said, wait a minute, let's ask the world itself how it works. You want to know how the world works? Ask it. What do you mean ask it? Let's do an experiment. Let's see. Let's see exactly what happens. And we'll look at what happens, we'll observe what happens, we'll measure what happens, and on that basis, we'll begin to see the various relationships in terms of how the entire system works. And then we'll begin to think and we'll figure out why it works that way. This approach, which may seem to be so simple now, this approach called the scientific approach, was never known before Newton and Galileo, really. No one ever did it that way. No one ever literally began to measure, to observe, and to experiment before Galileo and Newton in such a systematic way. Now that Newton discovered the mathematics which would help in those discoveries. Now you may say, oh, sounds great. Sounds really great. What was so fascinating about this? Well, the amazing thing was that Newton did all this in 1 year. When he was 24 years old. He did it. I forget the exact year, but the year, I think it's 1640 something, I forget the exact year, but that year is called, in all books of physics, Annus Mirabilis, or the year of the miracle. Because in 1 year, he figured out, which no one had ever known since the beginning of the world. He understood deeper into the Gashmias, or the astronomical and physical nature of the world, more than any man had ever understood since the beginning of time. From that aspect. I'm not talking about the Kabbalistic aspect of Meister Bereshis, but from physics and astronomy, what he understood no one had ever done before. And he'd all done this in 1 year. So that he wrote the famous book later on called the Principia, which explained this. But in that 1 year, he ushered in the field of science. Science was never again the same before or after he left it in. And everything since the time of Newton is nothing more than a follow-up of Newton. You see, when they say that he was the greatest, probably the greatest physicist just about of all time, there's a reason. Because he started and ended the whole method of physics itself, him and Galileo, but mostly Newton. All of science is based on what he did. That's why the name of Newton is like a saint. When you hear the name of Sir Isaac Newton, it's like literally, it's like a saint. If there's anything called a saint in science, if such a thing is possible, Sir Isaac Newton is such a saint. Funny, because in his later years, he dropped science, and he became a Mashiach fanatic, a religious fanatic in alchemy and all kinds of kishuv and different things. He became involved in alchemy and all kinds of numerology, all this other stuff. He really became involved in the goyish pursuit of Kabbalah, except that he didn't know how to do it. He had no idea. So he went off with the crazy things that he was doing, really crazy Mashiach things, and he left science. It's funny. Probably there was something in him that said that there's something more, you see. But he went off into a crazy direction. I mean, he wasn't Jewish, essentially. He would have been an outstanding makubal. But it's more than that. You have no idea of the head that lies on his shoulders. You see, there's an incredible... Well, one of the things, and I just like to speak about it for a minute, that many people are under a tremendous fallacy, is that somehow a goy cannot learn Torah. Or if you have the head of a goy, or the head of a Jew who's not from, there's something wrong with it, and so on. And let's take each one of these things. Like, for example, the head of an Einstein. Einstein was great, but people who sit in the Torah, Gedolim, are much greater than Einstein. You see, because they sit in the Torah and so on. Well, it's an interesting thing. There's an old story that I once saw this. I saw this in the Jewish Observer. I think this, I forget who actually said this, but there was once a student who learned under Albert Einstein, and then later on he learned under Reb Chaim Brisker. I don't know if you heard of Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. Reb Chaim Soloveitchik was a giant head. Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, it's not only a question that he was one of the greatest in the world of his time, it's more than that. Reb Chaim Soloveitchik started a whole new way of thinking in Torah. A very precise, analytical, beautiful way of thinking. You see, he was a revolutionary thinker, Reb Chaim Brisker. Besides the fact that he was one of the greatest in the world, one of the people about the Gadol Hador, Reb Chaim Brisker. And he was known for his crop. Reb Chaim Brisker was tremendous. So there was a student who had learned under Einstein and who had also gone to Reb Chaim Brisker and learned on him. So they once asked him, they asked him, basically, what is your opinion? So he said, which is a story that comes down, it's basically, he said that Einstein had twice the head of Reb Chaim. Twice his head. And the truth is, when you look at the work of Einstein and you look at Reb Chaim, there's no question that Einstein had twice the head. And in order to have twice the head of Reb Chaim, it's astounding. And Einstein was not from at all, in any sense. Now, if you think Einstein had a tremendous head, which he did, believe me, the head of Sir Isaac Newton either was equal or greater. You should know, Newton. And Isaac Newton was a classic guy. A total guy. In the total sense of the word. But the head that was on this guy's shoulders was literally almost nothing short of a miracle. Because it's one of the greatest minds that has ever existed on the planet. The mind that is able to see in 1 year, which revolutionized the thinking of mankind, so that never again, everything you see out there, from electric bulbs to atomic bombs, it all comes from one way or another from Isaac Newton. And the method and the beginning that he gave. Now what does all this have to do with us? You see, sounds interesting. What does that have to do with us? There's a method to this madness. And it's called timing. Because Isaac Newton, Galileo appeared at the same time as Rabbeinu Yitzchak Luria, and Isaac Newton appeared essentially at the same time, similar times as Shabtai Tzvi. What does all this have to do with us? And now you will see that there was something very, very deep going on here. The fundamental idea, the Ari, Rabbeinu Yitzchak Luria was a Mashiach. Not only was a Mashiach, he did something which is the true function of the Mashiach. And we will, in the coming weeks, begin to explain you the heart of the Messianic process, something that most people have no idea what a Mashiach is really supposed to do. But what that was the Ari. What the Ari did was, and what the Mashiach, what the Ramchal did also, and what the Mashiach, the ultimate Mashiach will do in the most perfect way, is to reveal the hidden light and the greatest light of the Torah itself, so that suddenly it becomes visible to everyone. What happens when the real Mashiach comes? The pasuk says, "Umola oretz deis Hashem kamayim liyom mechasim," and the world will be filled with the knowledge of the Rebbeinu Shalom like the waters cover the sea. Now, do you ever think about that pasuk? That's not a simple pasuk. What that pasuk is saying is that what? That when the Mashiach appears, everybody's going to believe in the Rebbeinu Shalom. Everybody. Everyone will believe in the Rebbeinu Shalom as an act of complete simplicity. Just like the waters cover the sea, that's how much everyone will believe in the Rebbeinu Shalom with a total certainty. Now, how is this possible? How can one man, the Mashiach, convince all the minim, all the apokosim, the atheists and the communists and every other person who doesn't want to know anything about Ruchnius, that there exists a Rebbeinu Shalom, and not only that, with absolute certainty? How is this possible? You see, will he be a magician? No. It's simple that he has access to a hidden light. And if that light would ever be revealed, everyone will believe in the Rebbeinu Shalom. And that light is the light of Torah. It's the light from Adam Rishon. You see, it is what's called the Or Golos, or the hidden light that Adam never had. And when that light comes down, what will suddenly become available is what's called total information. Suddenly, everything will become understood. Not in theories or in controversies, but with definite facts. So that the Mashiach, if you think that the Ari was good, the Ari is a miniature, primitive version of what a Mashiach is. You see. So that when a Mashiach looks at you, there's not one thing about you or anything you've ever done that he can't instantly see on his own, or tell you from the moment that your soul suddenly came to existence until this time, everything which happened to it and why it did happen to it. That's the power of Mashiach. You see, or the power of Mashiach is to literally say something and it would instantly happen anywhere in the world. The Mashiach would have such hatzlacha, that anything he does meets with instant 1,000% success. And the Mashiach has Tiferes, which is tremendous complete knowledge. A knowledge that's so high that he is higher than the Malachim. He knows more than the Malach HaShoresh. That's how high his Chochmah is. That's what it says. It says here that Mashiach will be higher than Avraham in knowledge, higher than Moshe Rabbeinu, and higher than the Malach HaShoresh in his Chochmah and his knowledge. Can a man like that, with that kind of understanding, fail to convince the entire planet of the existence of God? He will know how to reconcile the Torah with all scientific philosophies. More than that, he will tell the scientists themselves, ultimately, what the ultimate theories of the universe are. And they will see it instantly by all their experiments. He will explain to them what they have been searching for hundreds of years, and which are complete problems to them. And he will tell them clearly what the answer is, and he will show them how that answer lies in the Torah, and what the deep meaning of all of it is. And they will see instantly that what he's saying is correct by actual observation and experimentation, without a question. And they'll say, how do you know this? Where did you get this information? And then when he opens up the Torah itself and shows them, they will see instantly that the Torah is the total emissaire book. It's a totally truthful book, and it has all knowledge in it. But there's only one man who can do it, and that's the Mashiach. He has that key, and that's the hidden light. Now that key, to a slight extent, was given to the Ari, and to even slighter extent was given to Ramchal or Moshe Chaim. They had this information in very small degrees, you see. And the time of the Ari was the beginning of the revelation of that knowledge. So that the time of the Ari was the beginning of the true Messianic time. At that point in time, the Jews could have been zocher, or worthy, of the coming of the Mashiach in the time of the Ari. So that the Ari was given permission to reveal what he knew. You see, why? Because the Messianic period was coming very close. The period of the Ari, within what? Within that period of time, was supposed to be the Emosa Mashiach. That's really what it was. That's why the Ari appeared on the scene. Why was the Ari on the scene there? You see, why? Why was a man of such extraordinary power appear on the scene at that point? Because the Jews were about to be worthy of a Mashiach. That's why. And the Ari was the candidate. But what happened? What happened ultimately? Was the Ari successful? No. The Ari told Rav Chaim Vital, be careful, because the Mashiach ben Yosef is in trouble. You see. And what happened? The Ari died at 38 years old, taking all that stuff, or most of it, with him. Which means that the Jew were not zocha. Now, let's go do our homework. What happens when the Jews are not zocha to the Mashiach coming? What happens? What happens to all that kedusha, that messianic kedusha? What happened in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, in the second Beis HaMikdash, or in the first Beis HaMikdash? Okay? Let's look at it. Let's analyze it, and let's see how well we did our homework. When the first Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, where did the Shekhinah go? Where did it first? Where did the tremendous kedusha of the Shekhinah travel to? Greece. What did Greece suddenly invent? Chochmah, Plato, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all the Greek philosophers. Suddenly there was an incredible mushrooming of all the incredible wisdom of philosophy of ancient Greece, which was really, by the way, the foundation of all science. What happened in the second quarter of Beis HaMikdash, the second destruction of the second temple, when the Shekhinah again was exiled? Where did it go? One of the places went to Christianity. But what was Christianity? Christianity is a Judaism. It's a messianic religion. It's a messianic religion, which is a twisted messianic religion of Judaism. So we see that when the Shekhinah departs, or when the kedusha that the Jews should have, that should bring the Mashiach, departs in some way, and it goes into the klipa, or into the tumah, or into what? Into the domain of the Sultan, because of his accusations. What happens to it? Where does it filter? It filters into false messianic movements, or into enormous chokhmah among the goyim. Well, what happened in the time of the Ari? Was there a false messianic movement? 100%. Shabbat Tzvi. Never again was there a possibility of such an incredibly powerful messianic movement as in the time of the Ari. Shabbat Tzvi was so great because he borrowed the light of the Mashiach. Shabbat Tzvi was not a real Mashiach. He was a twisted Mashiach, just like Jesus is a twisted Mashiach. But a piece of the light of Mashiach was in Shabbat Tzvi. You see, the world thinks that Shabbat Tzvi was a false Mashiach. You see, just like the world thinks that Jesus was a false Mashiach. And it is true, they were false. But that doesn't mean that they didn't have some aspect of a light which is true. Because the thing is that if Jesus or Shabbat didn't have some aspect of Mashiach, they could have never convinced the world of who they were. Except that the light that they had was the light from the Satan. It was the light of the Mashiach in the hands of the Satan. You see, that's what it was. So it was the light of the Mashiach, but in a twisted, disfigured form. That's why they had this messianic fervor and messianic power. But they were totally false people, because it came from the Satan. So Shabbat was the Mashiach from the Klippas. He was a Mashiach, where? From the Satan. And he was a false Mashiach, sent to stir Klal Yisrael astray. Because what the Satan says, if you are not zocher to a real Mashiach, nadach, have a false one. Let me take the same light and give you a false one. Just like what? The Satan said, you don't want a Beis HaMikdash? Here. Let's have another messianic religion in the world which will compete with you and constantly attempt to destroy you and say that they took over you, they have what? Followed in your path, and they are the real Jews and they have the real Mashiach. That's what you've earned. Because you have failed to bring the Mashiach. You have created a Frankenstein, which looks like the Mashiach, but runs off and kills people. You see? It has the mask of the Mashiach, but it's a murderer, it's a Tzeach. But it looks just like a Mashiach. Shabbat, he looks like a Mashiach, but he's crazy. And he takes people and turns them away from Torah. But he looks like a Mashiach. How can a person look like a Mashiach? I don't mean physically, but spiritually. Because he had the power of the Mashiach. He did, in his own way. So we see again that the fact that Klal Yisrael failed to bring the Mashiach resulted in the Shabbat Tzvi. When the Ari died, Shabbat Tzvi in a certain sense was born. Not exactly in the same year. But when the Ari died, well, the failure of the Jews to see the Mashiach at that time ushered in the era of Shabbat Tzvi. But that was one example. Another example. What else do we see what happens when Klal Yisrael fails to what? When they lose the light of the Shekhinah, they fail to bring in a Mashiach. Then the light that they have of a spirit, of an extraordinary wisdom, goes into the hands of the Goyim. And again we saw this. Newton, Galilean Newton, appearing at the same time as the Ari in chapter 3. You see, almost coincidentally. So that suddenly, what the Jews failed to have, the Jews failed to take the light of the Torah and to see the unity of all creation, the unity of the Bnei Shalom. So what the Bnei Shalom says, you fail to see my unity, then you will see unity in the Gashmias. Because that's what it is. When the Jews don't take the power of Kedusha to see the Echad in the Bnei Shalom in Ruchnias, then their punishment is that the Bnei Shalom says, you will see my unity in Gashmias. You will understand the workings of the world, but you will not understand the workings of the heavenly world. So you may say, so what's the difference? That's also Chachma. But there's a difference. Because when you understand the workings, the unity which exists in the Shamayim and the Ruchnistic world, you also understand that there's a Rabbanu Shalom in the world. But when you see the unity which exists in the physical world, you think that you can control it. And you own science and technology. So you take that unity for your own arrogance and for your own control. So the unity in the world of Gashmis, in the physical world, makes man think that he's a god. Whereas the unity in Ruchnias tells man that the Bnei Shalom is God. You see the difference. But that was the Einish of Klal Yisrael. You fail to see my unity, you refuse to see who I am, then you will see what? Who I am through the physical world. But then that will seduce you away from me, because then the Satan will become much more powerful. Because if you think you had a Yetzirah before science and technology, you haven't seen any Yetzirah until science and technology appears. You see. Because the physical universe will become such a Yetzirah for you, such seduction, that you will barely be able to survive. You see. So the power of that Hasagas Yechudo, or the power of that ability to see unity, what? Filtered into science and technology, into the Goy Shavel, so that now we sit here, totally, what? Imprisoned by the incredible Chokhmah and power of the Goyim. And we can barely open our mouth and defend Torah against it. Barely. You see. For every little chiddush that somebody comes out, for every little idea, for every little article which is written in the Jewish Observer, there are 20,000 articles written in the Journal of Physics, which are thousands of times vastly superior in Chokhmah and technology. One IBM computer is vastly superior in its design and the Chokhmah which goes on to understanding it. Yet anything we produce, basically in the world of Torah, in today's age, what can compare with that? What can compare to the design of a spaceship, or the ability to send a man to the moon. Do you have any idea of the complexity of what's involved? Or even to set up a space shuttle? Of what even a car. You know what goes in the construction of a car? You know the timing and the interaction of hundreds of thousands of engineering parts that have to go even just to design a car, or a plane, or a rocket ship, or an atom smasher? It's staggering. Can we compare the chokhmah and the wisdom that goes on in that to what? To the chokhmah that goes on in anything that we can understand in Torah? We're like blind people today in what we know of Torah. We know almost nothing from Torah, you see. We're almost totally blind and totally ignorant. Whereas the scientists march on, so they come out with new electronic inventions, discs and tapes, and every new incredible conception, so that one day they'll simply have what? In the hand of a watch, you're able to speak to anybody in the world, or know anything, because it'll tap into the main computer that has all information embedded in it. They already have the ability. They already have the ability to take the entire Library of Congress and put it into what? Into a couple of discs. You know how much information there is in the entire Library of Congress? There are millions and millions of books in the Library of Congress. They can reduce the entire thing into what? I think into a closet full of discs. So that anyone can literally have the entire Library of Congress in his own basement. That's what they can do by digitizing information. We don't begin to realize the scientific advances, and it's going further and further. We don't even realize, you don't even know what they're constructing these days. I mean, I keep watch of this and so on, because to me it's always an amazing fascination. But even the world of superconductors and so on, where they finally discovered how to conduct electric current with no resistance, you see, which is an astounding thing, so that they can literally make trains that simply shoot along magnetic tracks without any resistance at all, in any kind of sense, or lift all kinds of things. They can do incredible things, astounding things today. And the Bonishim seems to be giving them more and more chokhmah, more and more abilities. And what I've read, there's a small revolution in the wake going, where they now can make machines something like 1/4 of an inch long that can do hundreds and hundreds of tasks. Tiny little, what's called micro machines that are astounding. Or in terms of the level of automation, or the level of computers. It's amazing what they've done, you see. We now can hold in our hands in computers. We have a handheld computer. You don't realize that 30 years ago, in 1956, 30 years ago, or 30 years ago, the same machine which could do what you could do now in your hand, right, that little computer hand which you have, used to require an entire room of vacuum tubes, an entire room, and now it's in your hand. And what they say is that not very long, in another 5 to 10 years, the most powerful computer today, which is incredible in its ability and in its speed, will be reduced to a handheld computer in 10 years. See, that's what's going on in the world of science and technology. We're racing so far ahead that it staggers the imagination. But in the world of Torah, when we race backwards. We know less and less. We are further and further from the emes. What happened? Why is this? Why is it that the Rebbeinu Shalom blessed the Goyim with such a yichud, with the ability to understand how his world works? That's yichud. The world functions according to what? Hashem Echad. You see, the Rebbeinu Shalom's influence is in the world. Why is the Goyim able to understand this and see such tremendous unity and the laws of nature and the laws of physics and reality? And we cannot understand basically what's behind Torah. Because that's our onish. That's our onish. And I once expressed it before, which is one of the best ways I can express it. The greatest punishment that we have is that we say every day, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. We say it twice. We say it twice every day, but we have no idea what we're talking about. Because we do not understand when we say Hashem Echad. The Goyim do not say it at all. And they understand what Yichud is. You see. We say that there is one God, and we do not understand what that means. The Goyim refuse to say that about God, but they understand on the highest levels of what Yichud means, of what perfect balance and symmetry and unity is, because they have such incredible chokhmah, you see. But they refuse to acknowledge that it comes from God. That's what it is. We have the Echad, and they have the Yichud. That's the split. That's the split. So that we literally are impoverished in our ability to understand any depth of what goes on. And they are majestic in their ability to understand this. Except that we believe in the Rebbeinu Shalom, and they don't. That's our Inish. It's twisted. And where did this happen? Where did the schism take place suddenly? That Arizal was bereft of its true ability to understand Yichud, and the Goyim suddenly took off like a rocket ship in the time of the Ari. That's why the 16th to 17th century is so important. Why? Not because there existed a man at that time called Rav Yitzchak Luria or Ramchal, because that time constitutes a time of an opportunity which is completely lost by us. And that loss exists even today. What we lost then, we continue to lose today. Until today we see how far we've lost, how far we've come, and how much we've lost. And we see exactly what the consequences were of that failure. Just like I told you last time, the consequences of the fact that the Jews failed to bring the Mashiach in the time of Rabbi Kiva resulted in the exile into Arizal for the next 2,000 years and the death of the 10 martyrs. The inability to bring the Mashiach in the time of the Ari resulted in the incredible difference that we see out there today for the same reason. And that's essentially what it is all about. So we see again that there are patterns here. We see exactly that there are opportunities that we have and there are opportunities that we lose. But that these opportunities just don't simply evaporate. They're given to someone else. You see. And ultimately, the Mashiach will come and completely redeem all those opportunities. And what he will do is take the koyach away from the goyim and put it back into the Torah, so that the Torah will become the most technological and the most superior instrument and chokhmah and wisdom that has ever been known by the mind of man. Ancient.
We're not supposed to say?
We're supposed to learn.
So why?
Why are they constantly being... Yeah, but just in general, the Jewish people, or was there a big test, like Rabbi Akiva's students?